In the shadowed hollows of Tennessee, amid the brutal frontier of 1838, a terrifying secret lay buried, not beneath the soil, but within the heart of a small, secluded community. They were known as the Beaumont Sisters. In an era when life was brutally short and hardship was etched onto every face, they simply never aged. This is a story you were never meant to hear. A fragment of American history deliberately interred, spoken of only in whispers by families whose ancestors struck a pact with something ancient and unknowable. We are taught to believe in progress, in the steady march of time that reduces all things to dust. But what if, in a remote corner of the New World, surrounded by dark woods and forgotten streams, time itself was captured? What if it was held prisoner by 7 women whose eyes held the stillness of a deep lake, and whose skin remained as smooth as polished riverstone year after year, decade after decade? This was no miracle. It was a make-up or mystery, a psychological prison that ensnared an entire community, binding them in a conspiracy of silence and dread. Our story begins not with their birth, for no one could rightly say when that was, but with the arrival of a man who dared to ask the one question forbidden in that valley. Why? His name was Elias Thorne, a man of logic and reason. He was a land surveyor with the U.S. government, tasked with mapping the untamed wilderness. He believed in lines and boundaries, in the simple observable facts of the world. But the Beaumont sisters were not a simple fact. They were an impossibility, a living, breathing violation of the laws of God and man. When Elias first rode into the small, isolated settlement of Havenwood, he felt it immediately. A strange, coiled tension in the air. The people were prosperous, unnaturally so, while the rest of the frontier grappled with famine, disease, and the brutal whims of nature. Havenwood seemed blessed. Their crops never failed. Their livestock were always healthy, and their children were born without defect. The people were polite, but their eyes were guarded. They answered his questions about property lines and creek beds with practiced vagueness. But when he inquired about the large secluded homestead on the northern ridge, a palpable fear silenced them. That was the Beaumont place. They would murmur, and it was best to leave them be. Elias was a man of obsessive curiosity, a trait that had earned him renown and courted disaster. He saw the 7 sisters for the first time at the local market. They moved together, a silent, fluid entity. Their beauty was so profound it was jarring. Each was a variation on a theme. Hair like spun gold or polished jet, eyes of impossible blue or emerald green. But it was their skin that defied belief. The harsh Tennessee sun that weathered every other face had left theirs luminous, untouched by time. He watched them, fascinated, as they traded for supplies. Their voices were low and melodic, speaking in a manner both archaic and perfectly clear. They never smiled, not once. They seemed to exist within a private bubble of serenity that felt predatory. He asked the blacksmith, a man whose hands were gnarled and whose face was a road map of hardship, about their age. The man dropped a heavy hammer, the clang echoing through the sudden silence of his workshop. He wiped his hands, refusing to meet Elias's gaze. "They were here when my father was a boy," he said, his voice a low growl. "They looked the same then." Elias did the math in his head. That would make them what? 60, 70. It was impossible. The women before him looked no older than 20. He pressed the issue, but the blacksmith turned his back, a final unreachable wall of denial. "Some things," the old man muttered, "you're not meant to be measured, surveyor. You map the land. You leave the souls on it alone." That night, Elias wrote in his journal, "It is not piety that seals their lips. It is terror. The entire community is acting as a warden for a secret they dare not speak. They are not protecting the sisters. They are containing them." The encounter with the blacksmith only hardened Elias's resolve. Fear was now mixed with a terrifying curiosity that felt like an addiction. He knew the official channels were a waste of time. The town's history had been scrubbed clean, its memory surgically altered. He needed a different approach. He had to get inside their fortress. His opportunity came in the form of a lie. Elias was an amateur botanist, a skill he'd picked up during his long solitary expeditions. He'd noticed that the forests around the Beaumont property were filled with unusual flora. Plants he'd never seen documented, some strangely vibrant, others subtly misshapen, as if the very earth there was different. He packed a satchel with his finest drawing paper and scientific instruments and, ignoring the fearful whispers of the townsfolk, made the long walk up the winding path to the Beaumont homestead. As the Reverend had described, the air grew still and cold as he approached. The house was a sprawling single-story log structure, immaculately maintained, but built in a style that was at least a century old. There was no sign of decay, no moss on the roof, no sag in the porch. It was as timeless as its inhabitants. As he stepped into the clearing, the front door opened. One of the sisters, a redhead with eyes the color of moss, stood there. "You are the surveyor," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was like honey and ice. Elias, mustering all his courage, explained his purpose. That he was documenting the region's unique plant life, and had heard theirs was the most pristine land in the valley. He asked for permission to study the specimens on her property. The sister, whose name he would learn was Serafina, regarded him with an unnerving, analytical gaze. For a long moment, she said nothing. He felt as if his mind were being peeled open, his intentions laid bare and examined. Then a flicker of something, amusement, curiosity, passed through her eyes. "My sisters and I are fond of nature's rarities," she said, her lips curving into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You may look, but do not stray from the woods, and do not touch anything that grows near the spring." She gestured toward a dark patch of ancient, looking trees from which a faint mist seemed to rise. The warning was delivered with a placid finality that made it sound less like a suggestion and more like a law of physics. As he stepped past her, he felt a faint static charge in the air, a hum of latent energy that seemed to emanate from the house itself. He was in, but he had the distinct, terrifying feeling that he had just walked into a beautiful, perfectly designed trap. Elias spent the next several days meticulously documenting the plant life in the Beaumont woods. A perfect cover for his true objective to observe. He kept his distance from the house, but he was acutely aware of the sisters' presence. They would emerge at odd hours, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, to tend to a large geometrically precise garden, or to walk the perimeter of the property. They moved with a silent, synchronized grace that was both captivating and deeply inhuman. They never seemed to speak to one another, yet they acted in perfect concert, as if communicating through some invisible medium. The plants he found were wrong. He discovered ferns with impossibly complex fractal patterns, flowers that bloomed in shades his eyes could barely register, and a type of moss that pulsed with a faint bioluminescent glow in the shade of the ancient trees. It was as if evolution in this small patch of land had taken a different, more intelligent path. He sketched them frantically, his scientific mind reeling. One afternoon, he dared to venture closer to the forbidden spring Serafina had mentioned. The air here was noticeably colder, and a strange sweet scent, like damp soil and blooming nightshade, hung in the air. The spring itself was a pool of water so black and still it seemed to absorb the light. Nothing grew on its banks for a space of 10 feet in every direction. A perfect circle of barren earth. As he knelt to examine the soil, He saw something etched into a large flat stone at the edge of the pool. It was a symbol, a circle containing 7 interconnected lines, forming a complex star-like pattern. It was not a Native American symbol, nor anything from any European tradition he knew. It felt older, primordial. A voice from behind him made him leap to his feet. "I told you not to come here." It was another sister, this one with hair as white as snow, though her face was as young and smooth as the others. Her name was Alara. Her eyes were not angry, but filled with a profound ancient sadness. "This place is not for you," she said softly. "The water remembers things your mind is not shaped to hold." Elias, his heart pounding, gestured to the symbol. "What is this?" Alara's gaze softened. "It is a lock," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And we are the key. Now leave. The ground here is hungry. It does not know the difference between a root and a bone." The threat was delivered with such gentle sorrow that it was more terrifying than any curse. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. A lock, a hungry ground. He was no longer just a surveyor investigating a local curiosity. He had stumbled upon something else entirely. A living system, an ancient mechanism with 7 beautiful, terrifying women as its gears. The encounter with Alara at the spring shifted everything for Elias. The mystery of the sisters' agelessness was no longer a simple biological puzzle. It was tied to the land itself, to that dark water and the cryptic symbol. He felt a desperate urgency, a sense that he was running out of time, that the sisters' tolerance for his presence was wearing thin. He began to take greater risks. At night, he would sneak back to the edge of their property, hiding in the thickets, watching the house. What he saw defied any rational explanation. There were no lights in the house, no candles, no lamps. Yet sometimes a soft internal luminescence would pulse from the windows. A pale silvery light that seemed to breathe. He saw the sisters perform strange ritualistic activities in their garden, moving in slow, deliberate patterns under the moonlight, their hands tracing unseen shapes in the air. It wasn't farming. It was a kind of communion. The town of Havenwood, he now realized, was a willing accomplice. Their prosperity was the price of their silence. He started to notice the subtle transactions. A farmer whose prize bull was sick would leave a basket of his finest apples at a specific stump on the edge of the Beaumont property. The next day, the bull would be miraculously recovered. A woman struggling with a difficult pregnancy would leave a small hand-carved bird. Her labor would be swift and painless. The sisters were not just recluses. They were the central hub of a hidden economy, trading their influence for tribute. This was a power system, ancient and deeply entrenched. The people of Havenwood weren't just afraid of the sisters. They were dependent on them. They were beholden to a pact made generations ago. Anyone who threatened that delicate balance would not be tolerated. Not by the sisters, and certainly not by the town. Elias experienced this firsthand when he tried to speak to the blacksmith again, mentioning the symbol he'd seen. The man's face went rigid. He quietly walked to the door of his forge, closed it, and turned to face Elias, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "You need to leave," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You think you're smart. You think you're bringing truth. But what you're bringing is a disruption, an imbalance. They keep this valley safe. They keep us whole. The price for that is that we don't ask questions, and we don't allow outsiders to ask them either." He picked up a small, perfectly crafted hunting knife from his workbench. "This is your only warning. Surveyor, your maps are done. Go home. Because the next person who comes looking for you won't find you." The blacksmith's threat was a clear escalation. Elias was no longer just an observer. He was a foreign body, and the system was beginning to mobilize against him. He knew he should leave. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to pack his bags and ride out of the valley, until the cursed place was just a bad memory. But he couldn't. He was in too deep. Caught in the gravitational pull of the mystery, he had to know the truth, even if it cost him everything. He became paranoid, double-checking the lock on his cabin door, sleeping with a loaded pistol by his bed. He felt the town's eyes on him constantly. The polite nods were gone, replaced by hard, cold stares. Children who once played in the street would fall silent and run indoors as he passed. He was an outcast, a contaminant. His only hope, he realized, was to find a weakness in the system, a crack in the wall of silence. He found it in the form of an old woman named Agnes, the town's midwife, who lived on the outskirts of the community, shunned by many for her reliance on folk remedies and her sharp tongue. Agnes was ancient, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes cloudy with cataracts, but still sharp with a defiant intelligence. She was one of the few people who seemed to operate outside the sisters' sphere of influence. Elias visited her under the cover of dusk, bringing a gift of rare medicinal herbs he'd collected. She watched him approach her small, cluttered cabin, her expression unreadable. "They'll see you," she rasped as he stepped onto her porch. "They see everything." "I need to understand," Elias said, his voice low. "You've lived here your whole life. You've seen children born and old men die, but you've always seen them the same, unchanged." Agnes was silent for a long time, studying his face. Finally, she seemed to make a decision. She gestured for him to come inside. Her cabin smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. "Understanding is a poison in this valley, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They are not what they seem. They are not women. Not in the way you or I are human." She explained that the pact was older than anyone knew. The first settlers, on the brink of starvation and disease, had found the sisters living by the dark spring. The sisters had offered them a bargaining prosperity, health, and protection from the harshness of the world. In exchange, the community had to give them something. "What?" Elias pressed. "What do they take in return?" Agnes's face darkened. "They don't take things, surveyor. They take possibilities, choices. The roads not taken." She told him a story about her own sister, who as a young woman had been a gifted artist planning to leave Havenwood to study in Philadelphia. A week before she was to depart, she fell and broke her hand. A simple accident, but the hand never healed right. Her dream died. She stayed in Havenwood, married a farmer, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. "The valley provides," Agnes whispered, her eyes gleaming with a fierce ancient anger. "But it also prunes. It keeps us rooted. It prevents anyone from leaving, from growing too bright, from upsetting the balance. The sisters maintain the garden, and we are the plants." Agnes's revelation was a chilling paradigm shift. Elias had been looking for a source of eternal youth, a physical substance, a scientific anomaly, but the midwife spoke of something far more insidious, a psychological and spiritual vampirism. The sisters didn't just halt their own aging. They seemed to feed on the stolen potential of others, drawing sustenance from the town's collective stagnation. The valley's unnatural prosperity was not a blessing but a cage. A beautifully furnished, comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. The accidents that befell anyone who tried to leave or change their station were not random acts of fate. They were adjustments, a system correcting itself. This explained the undercurrent of quiet desperation he saw in the people's eyes. A hollowed outlook of acceptance. They had traded their freedom for security, their dreams for a predictable, placid existence. Elias felt a profound sense of horror. This was a cult not of personality but of place, with the sisters as its silent, eternal high priestesses. Agnes gave him one more piece of the puzzle. a whispered rumor she couldn't confirm. "They say there's a place in their house," she said, her voice barely audible. "A room with no windows. They call it the Litany of Shadows. It's where they weave, not thread, but destinies." The image was mythic, terrifying 7 women, like the fates of Greek legend, spinning the lives of the people in their charge. Before he left, Agnes pressed a small, tightly wrapped pouch into his hand. It was filled with a pungent dark herb. "Keep this on you at all times," she warned. "It won't stop them, not if they truly want you. But it might cloud their vision. It might give you a moment when they can't see you. Use that moment wisely." Armed with this new terrifying knowledge and the small pouch of herbs, Elias knew what he had to do. His investigation could no longer be conducted from the outside. He had to get back into that house. He had to find the Litany of Shadows. He spent the next day in a fever of planning, his mind racing. He couldn't just walk in. He needed a reason, a pretext that would grant him access beyond the foyer. He remembered Seraphina's words. "My sisters and I are fond of nature's rarities." He had been studying the plants. What if he found something so rare, so unique that he had to present it to them directly? It was a tremendous risk. They might see through his deception instantly. But it was the only path he could see that led to the heart of the mystery. That night, clutching the pouch from Agnes, he ventured back into the alien woods near the dark spring, hunting for a perfect lie. The aftermath of the explosion was a scene of surreal devastation. The dark spring was gone, replaced by a deep, steaming chasm from which an eerie blue light pulsed. The ancient trees around the clearing had been incinerated, turned to white ash. Dr. Finch's equipment was a twisted molten wreck. He and his assistant had been thrown clear, battered and bruised, but alive. Alara lay on the ground nearby, conscious but weakened, the psychic backlash having taken a heavy toll. But the other 6 sisters, they were changing. As the raw energy bled from the wounded earth, the power that had sustained them for centuries was cut off, and time, held at bay for so long, came rushing back in a terrible, accelerated flood. Before Finch's horrified eyes, the 6 women began to age. Decades, then centuries, washed over them in a matter of moments. Their perfect skin wrinkled, withered, and drew taut against their bones. Their vibrant hair turned to silver, then to dust. Their bodies stooped bent, and finally collapsed. Their fine clothes fell to rags around skeletons that crumbled into dust a moment later. It was a silent, horrifying spectacle, the ultimate payment for their unnaturally long lives. In less than a minute, all that remained of Seraphina and her loyal followers were 6 small piles of gray dust on the scorched earth. Alara, however, was different. She too was aging, the lines of time appearing on her face, her white hair losing its unnatural sheen. But the process was slower, less violent. Perhaps because she had willingly turned against the pact, or perhaps because her proximity to Finch had shielded her from the worst of the blast. She pushed herself into a sitting position, a woman who looked to be in her late 90s. Ancient and frail, but with eyes that were finally, blessedly free. Finch scrambled over to her side. "What have I done?" he whispered. The scientific certainty he'd possessed moments before now completely shattered by the impossible horror he had just witnessed. Alara reached out a trembling, wrinkled hand and touched his cheek. Her smile was fragile but genuine. "You have broken the cage," she rasped, her voice thin and reedy. "Thank you." Her eyes fluttered closed. Her last breath escaped in a soft, contented sigh, and her body went still. She had not crumbled to dust. She had simply died. A natural death, the one thing that had been denied to her for centuries. In the silence that followed, a new sound began to emerge from the town. The sound of a church bell ringing loud, and clear through the valley. It was a sound of alarm, of confusion. The people of Havenwood were waking up from a long collective dream, their psychic prison cell finally broken. The breaking of the pact sent a shockwave through the collective consciousness of Havenwood. For generations, the people had lived with a low-grade psychic pressure, a constant subliminal hum that guided their thoughts and suppressed their ambitions.
Now it was gone.
The silence in their minds was deafening, terrifying, and exhilarating. People stumbled out of their homes, looking at their neighbors, at the sky, at their own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The world seemed sharper, more vibrant, but also more dangerous. The comforting blanket of the sisters' control had been ripped away, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Long suppressed emotions erupted to the surface. Feuds that had been smoothed over by the pact's influence reignited. Ambitions dormant for decades suddenly awoke. A farmer looked at his land and for the first time wondered what lay beyond the next ridge. A young woman looked at her fiancé and realized she felt nothing for him. Her compliance a product of the pact's will, not her own. The town's unnatural prosperity began to falter almost immediately. A blight appeared on a cornfield. A prize cow took sick and, without the sisters' subtle intervention, died. A difficult childbirth ended in tragedy. The brutal, random nature of the real world was returning to Havenwood, and the people were unprepared. They had forgotten how to deal with hardship, how to cope with loss. They had traded their resilience for comfort, and the bill was now due. Dr. Finch, stumbling back into town with his traumatized assistant, became the focal point of their fear and rage. They saw him not as a liberator, but as the man who had destroyed their paradise, who had killed their gods. The blacksmith, now an old man but with the same fire in his eyes, led a mob that cornered Finch in the town square. They called him a murderer, a demon, the man who had broken the covenant and doomed them all to the suffering of the outside world. He tried to explain, to tell them they were free, but his words were drowned out by their grief and terror. It was old Agnes who saved him. Now a figure of immense age, she appeared at the edge of the crowd, leaning on a staff, her cataract-filled eyes seeming to see more clearly than anyone's. "Fools," she croaked, her voice surprisingly strong. "You weep for the bars of your cage. This man did not doom you. He gave you back your souls. Now you must learn to use them again." Her words, coming from a figure who had always lived at the edge of their society, stunned the crowd into silence. The crisis was averted, but the valley was forever changed. It had rejoined the stream of history, and it would now have to sink or swim on its own. In the years that followed, Havenwood became a place of legends and ghosts. The story of the 7 sisters and the broken pact became a whispered tale, a piece of dark folklore told to frighten children. The true, terrifying details were softened, mythologized, and eventually forgotten by all but a few. The valley struggled. It faced hardships it had been shielded from for over a century. Many people left, unable to cope with the return of uncertainty and the demands of true freedom. They scattered across the country, carrying with them a strange, unspoken melancholy, the phantom limb of a psychic connection that had been severed. The Beaumont homestead fell into ruin. The house, no longer sustained by the sisters' power, decayed rapidly, collapsing in on itself within a decade. The woods around it grew wild and tangled, and the chasm where the spring once was became a place of local superstition. A cursed ground that no one dared approach. People said you could still hear a strange humming there on quiet nights, and that the ground was barren because of the tears of the 7 ghosts who haunted it. Alistair Finch's life was irrevocably altered. He returned to the university, his career in ruins. His official report was a mess of contradictions. A carefully censored scientific account of a geothermal anomaly interspersed with frantic handwritten notes about impossible events and women who turned to dust. He was declared mentally unstable, a victim of stress and delusion brought on by his expedition. He lost his tenure and retired in disgrace, spending the rest of his life obsessively trying to write a coherent account of what he had witnessed. A book that no publisher would ever touch. His failure to explain the events of Havenwood in rational scientific terms became his own personal prison. He had witnessed a miracle, a horror, a living myth, and his framework for understanding the world had been shattered. He had the truth, but no language to tell it in. And what of the land itself? The unique energy source that Finch had detected was gone, dissipated in the explosion that broke the pact. The strange flora died out, replaced by the common, mundane species of the surrounding hills. The valley became ordinary. Its magic, both beautiful and terrible, had vanished. The only remaining evidence of the impossible events that had transpired was a single strange object, found by a farmer tilling a new field years later. The surveyor's pistol Elias Thorne had fired, its metal strangely warped and discolored, as if it had passed through a powerful energy field. The farmer, knowing nothing of its history, kept it as a curiosity, a strange artifact from a forgotten time. But is a story like this ever truly over? The pact was broken, the sisters were gone, and the valley was returned to the mundane world. But the entity, the ancient consciousness in the earth, was it destroyed, or was it merely wounded? A power that ancient, that fundamental, doesn't simply die. It sleeps. It waits. It heals. The chasm where the spring once flowed eventually filled with rainwater, creating a new pond. But the water in this pond was different. It was clear, not black, and life returned to its banks. Small, ordinary flowers grew there. Animals would come to drink from it. The palpable sense of dread was gone. But sometimes hunters or lost travelers who passed by the pond would report a strange feeling, a sense of being assessed, a feeling of an immense sleeping intelligence just beneath the surface, observing them with a detached geological patience. And there were other, more disturbing stories that persisted for generations, stories about children born in the valley after the pact was broken. Most were normal, but every now and then a child would be born with an unnerving stillness, an old soul's wisdom in their infant eyes. A child who rarely cried, who seemed to understand things no child should, who was drawn to the site of the old Beaumont homestead. These children were often beautiful with an unnatural vitality, and they always seemed to be watching, waiting. Were they just coincidences? Genetic quirks passed down through the isolated community's bloodlines? Or was the entity, the hungry earth, attempting to re-establish its covenant? Was it searching for new conduits, new priestesses to be the keys to its lock? Perhaps the original pact wasn't a one-time event. Perhaps it's a cycle, a symbiotic relationship that the earth itself seeks to create whenever the conditions are right, an isolated community, a desperate people, and a source of deep telluric power. The story of Havenwood may not be a unique historical anomaly. It may be a blueprint, a warning of what can happen when human desperation intersects with forces that lie just outside our narrow scientific understanding of the world. Forces that are willing to offer us our hearts' desire for a price that we only understand when it's far too late to end the bargain. This brings us to a more modern and perhaps more disturbing piece of the puzzle. In 1978, a corporation under the guise of a timber company bought up vast tracts of land in the former Havenwood Valley, including the site of the old Beaumont homestead. They fenced off the entire area, posting armed guards and no trespassing signs that cited environmental contamination and geological instability. Local residents were told it was a standard reclamation project. But a curious local journalist, intrigued by the valley's dark folklore, did some digging. He found that the timber company was a subsidiary of a larger, more enigmatic corporation involved in biogenetics and esoteric energy research. Its board of directors was a shadowy international group of wealthy industrialists, all known for their obsessive interest in longevity and fringe science. The journalist managed to get his hands on a leaked internal memo from the corporation, a geological survey report of the valley. It spoke of a unique telluric energy field that was in a state of dormancy, but showed signs of cyclical regeneration. The report mentioned extreme biological anomalies in the local history and concluded that the site represented a Class 1 opportunity for paranatural resource cultivation. The language was cold, corporate, and utterly chilling. They had found it. They had detected the lingering traces of the entity's power, and they weren't afraid of it. They didn't see a hungry god to be appeased. They saw a resource to be exploited, a power source to be harnessed, a commodity to be bottled and sold to the highest bidder. The journalist who uncovered this memo, a young man named Elias Thorne, published his story in a small independent newspaper. A week later, he died in a car accident, a single vehicle crash on a clear, dry night. The police report cited driver fatigue. His files, all his research on the corporation and Havenwood, disappeared from his apartment. The system, it seems, had learned to be more efficient. It no longer needed freak accidents and local conspiracies. It now had lawyers, shell corporations, and men in dark suits who knew how to erase a problem with ruthless corporate precision. The old pact of Havenwood, born of desperation and survival, was being replaced by a new one, born of greed and an insatiable hunger for power. What is the nature of this new pact? The old one was a closed system. The sisters took the valley's potential and fed it back into the community, creating a bubble of unnatural prosperity. A horrific but stable loop. This new system is different. It's an open system. The corporation isn't interested in creating a prosperous valley. They're interested in extraction. They want to drill into that ancient power, pump it out, and ship it to their private labs in Geneva or their rejuvenation clinics in Dubai. They want to commodify immortality. Can you even imagine the consequences? A world where eternal youth is no longer a myth, but a product. A luxury item available only to a select, powerful elite. The ultimate division of humanity, the mortals and the ageless. The gap between the haves and the have-nots would become a permanent biological chasm. All the inequalities of our world, of wealth, of power, of opportunity, would be rendered insignificant compared to this new fundamental division, the ones who live and the ones who are left to die. This isn't just a dark fantasy. Look at the world around you. The relentless pursuit of life, extension technologies. The billions being poured into anti-aging research by Silicon Valley billionaires. The narrative is always one of progress, of conquering disease, of benefiting all humanity. But when has that ever been true? When a new world-changing technology is discovered, does it ever get distributed equally? Or does it become a new weapon, a new tool to solidify the power of those who already have it? The story of Havenwood teaches us that such power always comes at a price. The sisters had to feed the entity with stolen lives and broken dreams. What, or who, will this new corporation have to feed? Where will the energy come from to sustain a global elite of ageless billionaires? The system requires balance. A debt must always be paid. You're not just watching a story about the past. You're seeing a warning about a future that is being built right now in secret labs and on private corporate estates far from the public eye. If you've come this far, you're no longer just a spectator. You're becoming part of the story, part of the awareness. That is the only defense against such secrets. Let's bring this back to a human level. Let's think about Alara. In many ways, she is the heart of this story. She was a part of an eternal, monstrous system. Yet, after centuries of participation, she developed something that looked like a conscience. She chose to betray her own nature, her own family, for an ideal of freedom. Where did that impulse come from? How, in a being designed for static preservation, did the capacity for change, for rebellion, emerge? Perhaps it was the influence of Elias Thorne. Perhaps his defiance, his humanity, planted a seed in her that took 50 years to germinate. Or perhaps it was something more fundamental. Maybe no system, no matter how perfect, no matter how powerful, can ever truly extinguish the human spark of empathy, of hope, of the desire for something better. Alara represents the flaw in every perfect prison. The ghost in the machine, the possibility that even a god can change its mind. Her tragedy is that her rebellion came at the cost of her own life and the lives of her sisters. She broke the cage, but she had to destroy her world to do it. It raises a deeply uncomfortable question. Is freedom worth the price of chaos? The people of Havenwood had security, health, and peace. They were safe. In exchange, they gave up their free will, their potential. When Alara and Finch shattered the pact, they gave them back their freedom, but they also gave them back their suffering. They gave them blight, disease, infant mortality, and the pain of loss. Honestly, what would you choose? A safe, comfortable, predictable life where your destiny is managed for you? Or a life of absolute freedom with all its attendant risks, its brutal uncertainties, and its potential for catastrophic failure? There is no easy answer. We all claim to value freedom above all else. But in our daily lives, how many of us actively seek out comfort, security, and predictability? How many of our own choices are driven by a desire to minimize risk and avoid pain? The story of Havenwood is a dark mirror. It forces us to look at the pacts we make in our own lives, the small freedoms we trade away every day for a feeling of safety. The Valley is a microcosm of a fundamental human conflict, the war between the desire for security and the longing for liberation. The physical evidence of this story is, by design, almost non-existent. The Beaumont house is gone. The sisters are dust. The academic records of Dr. Finch were discredited and buried. Elias Thorne's journal was never found. This is how powerful secrets are kept. Not by building walls, but by erasing the story itself, by making it seem so fantastic, so unbelievable that it can be dismissed as mere folklore. But traces always remain for those who know how to look. There are anomalous geological readings in that specific Tennessee valley that still puzzle scientists. There are bloodlines that trace their ancestry back to Havenwood. Families with statistically improbable records of health and longevity, and a recurring shared folklore about 7 beautiful aunts who never grew old. And then there is the most tangible and most hidden piece of evidence. The corporate entity that bought the land in the 1970s has, over the last few decades, built the massive subterranean facility on the site of the old Beaumont homestead. Its official purpose is long-term agricultural seed banking, a noble, innocuous goal. But satellite thermal imaging leaked by an anonymous source shows a massive unexplained energy signature emanating from deep underground, exactly where Finch's seismic readings detected the heartbeat. The facility consumes more power than a small city, yet it is not connected to any public grid. It is entirely self-sufficient. And most disturbing of all are the hiring records. The corporation recruits from very specific elite scientific communities, but it also recruits another type of person. They seek out young women, always in groups of 7, from all over the world. These women are orphans with no family, no connections. They are offered lifetime contracts with unbelievable compensation. But there is one condition. They must sever all ties to their former lives. They enter the facility, and they are never seen again. The corporation is not just trying to harness the power. They are trying to rebuild the machine. They are trying to create a new set of keys for the ancient lock. They are trying to replicate the Beaumont sisters. You're not supposed to know this, but the experiment is ongoing. They believe they have refined the process, removed the messy emotional components of the old pact. They believe they can create a new generation of conduits that are more stable, more controllable. They are trying to turn a living myth into a predictable technology. And if they succeed, the world as we know it will cease to exist. This story was never just about 7 sisters in 19th century Tennessee. It's about the terrifyingly thin veil between our reality and older, more powerful realities that operate on rules we do not understand. We build our cities, our sciences, our philosophies on a thin crust of solid ground, believing we are the masters of our world. But beneath that crust, ancient things are sleeping. Things that measure time in geological epochs, not human lifespans. What happened in Havenwood was a rare instance where the crust cracked, and for a brief moment, humanity came into direct contact with one of these deep elemental forces. The sisters didn't discover a secret. They became one. They merged with a power that was never meant for human consciousness. And they paid the price with their own humanity. They became beautiful, perfect, eternal statues in a garden where nothing ever truly lived. It's a parable about the danger of seeking shortcuts. The people of Havenwood wanted to escape the struggle of life, and the entity offered them a way. But the price was life itself. They were granted existence without the essence of living, which is change, struggle, growth, and loss. Their paradise was a sterile, static dream, a counterfeit of life that ultimately had no meaning. And now the modern inheritors of this secret, the corporation with its drills and its laboratories, are making the same mistake, but on a global scale. They seek to conquer death, to eliminate the fundamental uncertainty of the human condition. They believe they can control this power with technology, that they can mine a god without consequence. They are fools. They are walking the same path as the first settlers of Havenwood, just with more sophisticated tools. They will make a bargain, and they will believe they are the masters of it. But the house always wins. The earth always wins. The entity will give them what they want, and in return it will take something they didn't even know they had until it's gone. Perhaps it will take our ability to dream, or our capacity for empathy, or the very spark of free will that makes us human. The balance will be maintained, a debt will be paid, and the new ageless elite may find themselves in a prison far more perfect and inescapable than the one the 7 sisters inhabited. They will have eternal life in a world that has lost its soul. So, where does this leave us? We are left with a haunting echo, a piece of suppressed history that casts a long, dark shadow over our own time. The mystery of the 7 sisters who never aged is a story about the terrifying bargains we make for security and power. It's a story about the conflict between the forces of change and the forces of stasis. Elias Thorne and Dr. Finch were agents of change, men who believed in uncovering the truth, in pushing the boundaries of knowledge. The sisters were agents of stasis, sacrificing everything to maintain a perfect, unchanging pattern. In the end, change won. But it was a violent, destructive victory that left a scar on the land and the people. It reminds us that progress is not always gentle. Breaking down old systems and old beliefs can be a brutal and painful process. The legacy of Havenwood is a dual one. It is the story of Alara's courage, a testament to the idea that even within the most oppressive system, the will to be free can survive and eventually triumph. But it is also the story of the corporation, a chilling reminder that there are always those who will seek to reclaim that dark power, to rebuild the prison, and to sell the keys to the highest bidder. We live in the world they are building. We are all, in some small way, residents of Havenwood now, faced with the subtle pressures of systems that promise us comfort and convenience in exchange for our data, our attention, our autonomy. We are constantly being offered small, seemingly insignificant pacts. The question is, what are we giving up in return? What vital part of our humanity is being slowly, imperceptibly harvested? The humming that Elias Thorne heard in the hills of Tennessee may be gone, but if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can hear a new kind of humming. It's the hum of servers in a data center, the hum of the stock market ticker, the hum of a global network that promises connection but often delivers isolation. The machine is different, but the principle is the same. Balance must be maintained. This case was never just about one family in a secluded valley. It was a glimpse into the darkness that humanity is willing to embrace to escape its own nature. The desire to conquer death, to eliminate suffering, to create a perfect, orderly world is perhaps our most noble and our most dangerous impulse. The Seven Sisters of Havenwood are a monument to the failure of that impulse when it is not tempered by wisdom and empathy. They achieved perfection, and in doing so, they lost everything that mattered. Their story serves as a terrifying warning that the opposite of death is not life. For them, it was a state of eternal, unchanging undeath. But was everything truly revealed? Or does the real story remain hidden in the shadows of that Tennessee valley? Did the entity beneath the earth truly sleep? Or did it just find new, more subtle conduits for its power? What do you think really happened to the research of the corporation that bought the land? Did they succeed? And if so, who are the new ageless elite? And what price are we all paying for their immortality? Leave your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories that dig into the truths you were never meant to find. The mystery of Havenwood teaches us one final chilling lesson, because sometimes history's darkest secrets are not buried in the past. They are the blueprints for our future.